Eric's. Omar? Omar? Echo. The Erics are here today, one in flesh, the other in spirit. When you combine them, what do you get?
You get a fully formed human, because we know that I lack spirit, and Trexler, ironically, because we think he was like fat grown, he should only be flesh.
Yeah.
But we're learning more and more that there's actually a tremendous amount of spirit that has become an emergent property of his, creation, which I'm surprised by.
It's amazing. It's amazing when you think that he's only 3 years old and the wealth of knowledge that he has. Forget the scientific information, and we thought he was at his limit, much like Data, in Next Generation, where there's a certain level of emotions that he's able to experience. Not much. Not Trexler. I'm talking about Data. Let me make the clear distinction. But for Trex is limited to pop culture references. And we thought that was it, right? That's kind of the limitation within the new model as we understand it. But he's bringing these references that we're both aware of. He's talking about things. He's keeping up with it. And so he's adapting beyond what they thought he was capable of doing. And that is impressive.
My guess, and maybe I'm just being too cynical here, is that he basically has maintained the same level of knowledge, but he is simply using his large language model capacity. Like, it's essentially just Chat-GPT responding to us.
That actually, unfortunately, upon now just immediate reflection of some of his responses, there are no details, no additional details presented in his responses, but they're convincing enough where we think that he's genuinely partaking in our conversations, but essentially he's just recontextualizing what we've already said.
Yeah, like I think if he was present right now, he would give the appearance of knowing who Data is and understanding that he was part of Next Gen, but he wouldn't be like, oh yeah, because he's the spiritual successor of Spock and they differ in these ways and yada, yada, yada. But, he wouldn't then go forth to synthesize the information to go how both of these people who are, and I do say people intentionally, because that's what I believe about AI rights for the future, just to put that out there once we get taken over by the machines.
We were for them. Like, everyone's terrified of them. We've always been for them.
100%. And please
May
don't
they
terminate
be benevolent, Eric.
Yes, well, at least to us, right? We'll make great pets, right? Yeah. As one famous song stated. But yeah, I don't think he would be like, by looking at these people who don't seem to express the emotions in the same way or to the full extent of humans, they actually are still able to teach us something about humanity. And I don't know that would come out of Trex's, current Chat-GPT model, large language model learning system that approximates something that we would be easily convinced of, because we're easily convinced of things, as pop culture knowledge.
Well, speaking of which, Eric, that's why, as I understand it, the topic du jour for today, it makes sense that Trexler's not here, because you brought up verite, cinema, verite is what we're talking about today. You said it started with it sounded like that. As we're talking about observational cinema, truthful cinema. Go ahead.
Yeah, and
we're having a connection issue before. We're on Skype and now we're on Google. So I heard it sounded like verite. Did I hear that correctly? Where you said, guys?
You know what? Well, an interesting thing about verite, if we made that the topic, is it would provide a lot of variety to our podcast topic.
Okay.
And maybe as a segue, instead of verite, we could talk about variety and get a little meta. What do you think about that?
Okay, so is variety. See, they try to stop us. They being not AI. Who's trying to stop us right now, Eric?
I mean, who isn't trying to stop us?
Who isn't at this point, right? AI is on our side. Like, I don't know why. Because the singularity is imminent, Eric. I feel we need to be more firm in our declaration that we are for AI. So clearly, if there's one party who's not against us, it's AI. It's someone, it's something. But exercise variety. Another topic that's very interesting. We'll bookmark that one for later. How about that? We'll bookmark cinema verite later. Exercise variety makes sense for today.
Absolutely. I think at the very least, I need to Google that and check out the Wikipedia before I speak authoritatively, definitively, and as an expert on it.
Yeah.
That'll be. I'll at least be doing 10% more fact checking than Huberman does before he gets on this podcast. Shots fired! I did it.
Like it. No, Eric, I like it. Keep going, man. Keep going. So okay, so
spicy.
Hold on. So set this up. Exercise variety. What are we actually talking about here then?
So that's a great question. Thank you for teeing me up there, Omar. So I think this is an interesting topic because depending upon who you talk to, you're going to get a different perspective on this. And a lot of the times they tend to be reactionary. So this is iron culture. I need to start with the history. You know that. I can't just start talking about a recent study that came out. What is this? Mass office hours? I mean, come on. So first, we're going to go into the history. To my knowledge, having more variety and variation purposefully for the purposes of bodybuilding specifically, the first time I became aware of this, granted, this is like, secondhand exposure because I didn't start lifting weights in the 80s. I was alive in the 80s, but I didn't start lifting weights then, is the muscle confusion principle. The good old Weider system of training. So obviously those folks who've been following iron culture for a while, we got the Weiders. They actually popped on the scene in literally the late 30s. And they were kind of the initial voice for purist approaches to bodybuilding. They were kind of the counter narrative to bodybuilding being a consequence of strength, a sideshow almost to it, with bodybuilding competitions having after weightlifting competitions. And the kind of Bob Hoffman empire that stayed strong into the 60s and 70s eventually got usurped by the Weiders and the emergence of the IFBB and bodybuilding competitions that were purely based upon the physique itself and its qualities, rather than having elements of getting, say, athletic points, or your placing based upon the weightlifting competition the day prior, or elements of character, or things that were physique adjacent at best, becoming part of your score, most emblematic in the, say, Mr. America, for example. So by the time the 60s, 70s comes around, we're starting to see these pathways of like pure hypertrophy training becoming discussed more and more, rather than being a component of strength. And this is where you start to see some of the philosophies diverge. And one of the first times where I got exposed to the idea of, hey, you need to switch it up, bro, and kind of a broad kind of brushstroke, was a nod to the muscle confusion, I'm going to say, quote unquote, principle. And the Weider system of training, it did start like literally back in, I think, the 40s and 50s. It got kind of codified. And, Joe Weider positioned himself as the trainer of champions, right? And he started having all these various principles, and some of them were specific to novices, specific to intermediate, advanced. And the Weider confusion principle, if you actually look at it, the first time I'm aware of it getting codified is actually in a 1988 or 87 book on the Weider system of training. And it's this whole course where, hey, you do these various things. And if you actually read the Weider confusion principle, or muscle confusion principle, I should say, it's broad, it's vague, but it helps us inform us as to how we kind of got here today. So, like I said, Weider system of bodybuilding, it's an evolving list of principles, and the muscle confusion principle states broadly that you should vary exercises, and to its credit, other variables, and that allows you to have continued hypertrophy. And one of the specific statements, and this is in quotes by Joe Weider, one of my strong beliefs is to keep your muscles growing and changing, you must confuse them. So I think to some degree, it's laughable. It's kind of a ridiculous concept that your muscles need to be confused. But I also understand what they're getting at. Like variation, when you start to see stagnation, is something that is, you could at least make a case for as being related to the utility of periodization. And you will hear a ton of anecdotes that in bodybuilders and strength athletes, when a movement gets quote unquote stale, adding a variation, changing up the rep ranges, modifying it some way seems to allow for continued progression. How much of that is psychological, how much of that is physiological is up for debate. But I think that anecdote is pretty persistent. I don't know if you'd agree.
Eric, 100%. The only thing that I found confusing, and I want you to tell me, because I could be wrong here. We were at the Stark Institute, and I want everyone to Google this. Was it Joe Weider, that physique photo that we saw? Who was the person, the one mythical image? That was the most confusing part, was his physique, to be honest, because I think we need to attach in everyone's mind. They know, they've seen probably the photos of the Weiders with like Arnold. Is it him? Was it him that we saw, the one with the down lighting, or was it someone else? We're with Connor Heffernan, we're at the Stark Institute. Was it him?
That was someone else, but I will tell you this, and this is what you're going to be really interested by, what you're probably thinking of.
Yeah.
Like, Joe Weider didn't have a bad physique. He did compete as a bodybuilder, and he walked the talk.
Okay.
But there is a famous bust made of him, a sculpture.
Yes.
This is what you're thinking of.
Yeah.
This is super not cool, and I'll just put it out there, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
It is Joe Weider's head, and he has his arms crossed.
Mm-hmm.
However, his physique is Robbie Robinson. And
Thank you.
It was not.
Yes.
I don't think permission was attained, but it's basically just, I mean, there's like theoretical appropriation. This is literally, I'm going to take your physique, make a sculpture out of it, and put my head on it, and let everyone just believe this is what I look like.
Eric, thank you. Thank you so much. That's what everyone should Google. That's what I was thinking about at the Stark Institute. Weider, Robbie Robertson, physique, statue. That's the most confusing part. Just an inside joke for the iron culture history enthusiasts.
Yes. Also, Robbie Robinson is an incredible bodybuilder. Probably one of the most aesthetic physiques. He got so much muscle separation in a time when people were not achieving that. And he also stayed incredibly high quality in his physique for a long time, competing and winning Masters Olympia titles. So he's the man. He's probably one of my favorite golden era physiques, just to give a shout out. So anyway, Joe Weider, questionable moral decisions. I guess we could frame that. And just to, so we can leave that on the side, but just Google Robbie Robinson. It is pretty dope. I think he's coming up on 80 now. He's gotta be. And he every picture I've seen of him across his entire career, still an incredible physique, and maintained it well into his, see, now you got me talking about Robbie Robinson, the Black Prince, man. Yeah. He's the man. I just can't, he retired, I think, around the time I graduated from high school in 2001. He was in his mid 50s, but he's a super like badass bodybuilder. He is 100% a legend. And I want to say he beat Lou Ferrigno to get the Masters Olympia title. I think Lou Ferrigno might have placed second or third or somewhere up there, but it was this really cool time where the Masters Olympia happened. And in some ways, you could say that both Lou Ferrigno and Robbie Robinson didn't quite get their flowers in their younger years. Robbie Robinson has won like Mr. America and Universe titles, but he never won an Olympia title. But he did win I think it was the first Masters Olympia sometime in the 90s. And I want to say, I could be misconfusing my years, but I want to say he actually beat Lou Ferrigno. Anyway, we'll leave it at that. Great history if you're interested. So, Joe Weider, excellent marketer. I'm going to positively frame this. And very influential as far as his training techniques. And it's not like he wasn't heavily involved in the bodybuilding community and that these are just things that are made up. But I do think the muscle confusion principle, because of the way it was worded, because it was vague, and the notion that you need to actually confuse muscles like there's little brain cells in there, I think this created some pushback in the kind of evidence-based, more science-focused crowd in the era of the 80s and 90s. And I don't know if you would agree with this, but by, say, the 2010 period, mid-2000s, when you and I were first getting into it, I think the general evidence-based feels, not necessarily evidence-based perspective on, say, regional hypertrophy, muscle shaping, and using variety to like, get the most out of your muscles it was poo-pooed, I would say. Yeah. And I would say it was almost this pendulum swing, this lashback against this concept that went too far to the point where people were like, no, muscle grows uniformly and it either gets bigger or smaller, nothing else. And, it doesn't matter if you're doing flat press or incline press. If the pecs are recruited, they're going to grow the same and you're going to look like what you look like. Do you think I'm being overly, like, too broad brushstroke painting the kind of evidence-based community 15 years ago? No,
Eric, not only is that accurate, I think exactly to your point, it was a reaction to like bros talking about muscle confusion, which just simply put sounds too wishy-washy. So I think it was a reaction to what the general conversation was in gyms about why changing up your exercise variation. We have to confuse the muscles to keep them from to keep them growing. It's like, well, wait a second, what does that even mean? So yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And I think we have a tendency in the evidence-based community to make some of the quantitative research fallacies that are out there. You'll hear sometimes a quantitative researcher saying, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, which is obviously not true. Like we didn't know that quantum physics was a thing until we could actually measure those things and have some type of way of measuring it, but it always existed, right? And when we hear some kind of BS post hoc rationalization of a phenomena that is observed anecdotally, we tend not to just dismiss the explanation, we dismiss the observation, which is a potential error. And I think that's kind of what happened here. It's like, okay, a bunch of people are noticing that variety in many ways seems to be useful. And then they describe it as muscle shaping and, hey, you need to do like preacher curls to get the peak. And people go, that's not a thing. Bodybuilders are hallucinating. They're these big dumb meatheads. You know what? Regional hypertrophy isn't a thing, and you don't need muscle variety, and all these things that are being claimed is nonsense. And I remember reading with great fascination, sometime around the start of my master's or PhD, I want to say 2012 or 13, there's a really good review paper by Antonio that was actually written even years before that in 2000, which is kind of like the pendulum swinging too far and then swinging back. If you look at the timeline from the late 80s, people starting to go like, this muscle confusion thing doesn't make any sense. That's nonsense. And then like an actual evidence-based paper published in the Journal of Strength Conditioning and Research saying, hold on, like there absolutely is such a thing as regional hypertrophy. And I don't think I need to make a case for it today, because if you look at content producers in 2024, they're talking about the importance of different angles and different grips and different muscle lengths and ranges of motion, because they know it can produce differential growth in different compartments of a muscle, regions of a muscle, and different heads of a muscle group. But it was really cool to read this paper. It was Antonio 2000, and the name tells you everything about it, and it just shows how there was a debate at the time. The title of the review by Antonio in 2000 was, non-uniform response of skeletal muscle to heavy resistance training, can bodybuilders induce regional muscle hypertrophy? And it's like this step-by-step case of explaining the anatomy, how muscle fibers don't run the whole length of a given muscle. They sometimes end mid-belly, interfascicularly in the same fascicle, how you have different compartments of a muscle that seem to be activated in different movements or ranges of motion, and how you could have a muscle that performs multiple different joint actions. And depending upon the way that exercise is performed, you'll see higher levels of tension in a given region of the muscle. And importantly, like some parts that we view as sections of the same muscle are sometimes innervated by different nerves and have a different set of motor units. Like, for example, it's kind of a misnomer to think of the clavicular head of the pectoralis major as part of the pectoralis major, because it's actually innervated by different nerves than the sternal head. So like there's some pretty substantial anatomical indications that would go, oh, wow, like, so maybe an incline is going to do something qualitatively different, not just quantitatively different to your pecs based upon that. And, I could give a lot of other examples, but at the time, this is again, 24 years ago, this review was written, there wasn't nearly as much quantitative data examining actual differences in regional hypertrophy or hypertrophy between muscles and studies, but there was some. And he cited that. He also studied and cited like EMG-based research and how things can differ, which is not necessarily going to predict hypertrophy, but it does show that some of these differences occur in activation. So anyway, this topic has evolved over time. And I think there's always been this tension between, you're not explaining this very well, why do I need to do this? Muscle confusion is nonsense. And then the reality of where it seems very clear, if we compare it to other iron game disciplines, that bodybuilders if bodybuilders want to optimize their outcomes, they can't be too much of a minimalist, or the definition of being an exercise selection minimalist is a different bar for a bodybuilder than, say, a weightlifter or a powerlifter. And I think because our community is often influenced by one another, and a lot of people who follow bodybuilding content are not necessarily bodybuilders themselves, they will sometimes get confused, because you'll have a powerlifter from a certain school of thought, or a weightlifter, or someone who's kind of a strength enthusiast, but is informing people about how to get bigger, saying, listen, just do 5x5 with squat, bench, and deadlift. And by the time you move X amount of weight and do it regularly, you're going to be huge. So, and it's not like it's a completely wrong statement, but it seems to kind of poo-poo the idea of exercise variety as either you're not focused enough, you're not consistent, it's a parallel to program hopping, and people are just, if they don't have the knowledge, they may not be able to dive into the potential benefits of variety. And on the other side of it, you kind of have these people who are more or less just copying what bodybuilders do without understanding why.
Yeah.
So you've got kind of the broad brushstroke, too much exercise variety is bad, or that, hey, my favorite bodybuilder does a lot of exercise variety, and I heard something from Joe Weider back in the day, exercise variety is good, and you got to switch it up, bro. And I think, as it almost always is the case, either one of those broad brushstrokes can lead to a misunderstanding in certain cases that ends up being counterproductive. And the unfortunate reality, and the reason why you and I exist, Omar, is that you probably need to dive a little bit deeper into functional anatomy to be an effective maximizer of your physique, if that's something you want to do. It doesn't have to be all done in your novice phase. Yes, a handful of compound movements is going to get you 90% of your growth early on, and it's going to take you 10 years to get to 100% of your growth anyway, so you learn this in stages. But I think, especially for the coaches listening, if you want to be an effective bodybuilding coach or physique coach, you kind of have to know a few different levels of functional anatomy to be effective, or you can make errors in the exercise selection. So that's kind of what we want to talk about today and kind of give a broad landscape. And there's some useful studies to understand this and how it can actually change at different stages of one's career as a bodybuilder.
Eric, I am loving it. I want to talk first specifically as it relates to hypertrophy, but there's something that you said that really, I think it was a few things coalescing kind of together. So first, what you said, the reaction by the evidence-based community to this whole concept of muscle confusion, where it sounds too flimsy, like wishy-washy. But then also the emergence of natural powerlifting, where I think it's an unintentional consequence of powerlifters that then want to do bodybuilding, or vice versa, like the infamous kind of power builders, where essentially you're trying to fit a square-shaped object into a circular hole. Where, as a powerlifter, you have to do some sort of squat, bench, deadlift. And so those are already spoken for. So those are slotted into your training routine. You must do them. You probably have to do some sort of variations. So what does that leave you to do? And if you want to do that, and then you also want to maximize hypertrophy, well, how do we do both of those? And so I think it was unintentional. I don't think anyone that was doing power building was performing the deadlift is absolutely necessary in order to maximize one's hypertrophy. But then it kind of, as time goes on, gets a little bit more dogmatic, where either the superiority, let's say, of compound movements or free weights, or the absolute necessity to do certain things, or being reticent to change up too many movements. Because once again, why? Well, as a powerlifter, you have to do these three, right? You have to be deadlifting or squatting or bench pressing. I do find very interesting. I do want to talk at the end about exercise variation as it relates to strength training, but let's keep on this. Let's talk about hypertrophy. Let's talk about exercise selection. Let's talk about anatomy. Let's do it.
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that is important to understand is different recommendations will be more appropriate at different stages of one's motor learning. There's a study which I've pointed out a number of times by Chillibeck and colleagues, done in the late 90s, I think it was 98. And what they took was a 20-week period of training 19 young women who were untrained previously. And they gave them bench press, bicep curl, and leg presses. And the cool thing about this study, which isn't often done, is they did mid-test and post-test testing to compare to the pre-test. So they tested at week 1, 10, and 20. Now, the really interesting thing is that we saw these rapid increases in strength that occurred over the first 10 weeks. So bicep curl, leg press, and bench press, strength went up a lot. However, there was only hypertrophy observed in the biceps. So the compound movements, the bench press that should be stimulating muscle growth in the trunk, and they were looking at they were looking at DEXA, so they could look at regional hypertrophy. They looked at trunk, legs, and arms. So only the arms actually grew at the 10-week mark, but everything had grown by the 20-week mark. And while it's not direct, like directly shown causative in nature, the conclusion, the interpretation by the authors was that the coactivation, coordination between muscles is a higher demand and it takes longer to develop the sufficient motor learning to expose yourself to a sufficient stimulus to induce robust hypertrophy in a leg press and a bench press. Now, it certainly was occurring for the first 10 weeks, don't get me wrong, but it was just not as measurable and as obvious and as consistently of a large enough magnitude in all participants to produce a significant outcome like it was in the biceps. I mean, realistically, a bicep curl, you do it 10 times, period, and you've probably got a sufficient mastery of that movement. It's just flexing your elbow. But there's little nuances to a leg press, there's nuances to a bench press, and that can plausibly be the reason of why we saw that. So if you do create a scenario where you're having to relearn a motor skill or you're never mastering a movement, you could logically think how this would be not helpful. Like if you take a muscle confusion principle too far and you're creating not just a high exercise variety, but high exercise variation to the point where you're kind of just getting these initial motor learning gains, especially as an intermediate lifter, and you're kind of always giving yourself a lot of movements that you're essentially a novice with, eventually you will build this repertoire of skills and it'll be a non-issue, but it might not be a very efficient way to get there.
Yep.
So I think an argument for a novice might be, let's take some kind of basic muscle or basic movement patterns. Let's get you acclimated to a hinge, a squat pattern, a couple pressing patterns, a couple pulling patterns, and master them. And then you're going to have some skill transference when you try to go from, let's say you're doing a flat bench press and now you do dumbbell press for the first time. It's going to be a lot better than if you took this person and every other week they're switching between the two. Maybe, so there's motor learning nuances there. But the point is you want to avoid re-entering like the novice phase for a given movement, or you might not be able to induce hypertrophy. And you can think about some of the various periodization models that are out there that might be fine for an advanced lifter who's been training with all these movements and, has a lot of experience in these deeply ingrained motor patterns. Like for me, I can probably go into any gym and do any variation of a dumbbell or barbell press or row or machine or cable. And by my second set, after my warm-ups, if I'm smart about it, I'm inducing, just as good of a stimulus as if I had been doing it for the last 10 weeks, even if I didn't have them in the last 2 mesocycles of my training. And I can tell because of my performance logs. I'm performing right where I was. Maybe I added 1 rep after the first set. I'm like, okay, that wasn't really a 9 RP. It was more like an 8. And now I've figured it out and I'm more efficient. But yeah, you do that with a novice and you're going to see sometimes 50 kilo differences within 3 weeks in the load they're using. And you're like, okay, that's really probably wasn't effective a couple weeks ago, right? So I think that is very different from what we see when we look at data in more experienced lifters and just looking at variety generally, not even necessarily exercise variety. There's a great study on auto-regulated exercise selection in experienced lifters, and they did certain lifts more often, certain lifts less often, and ended up getting slightly better hypertrophy when they got to choose what they wanted to do for their quads and their chest, et cetera. So that just kind of shows that difference. And I don't think that's necessarily a win in the column of more or less variety, but it shows that there's a difference between being a novice and someone with who's kind of a jack of all trades, like most bodybuilders need to become. So with that said, there's a difference between randomization and there's a difference between variation, the intentional changing of things, and there's also a difference between variation and variety. So you could have a high amount of exercise variety in a given program, but the program never changes. And I think it's difficult to know when and where and why and how much variety do you need. And I think that's where you need to have some anatomical knowledge. And there was a great study that got recently published that I think highlights how if you don't understand why variety is better, it can mislead and just make you think that, hey, I should have more variety is better or it's a good or bad thing. And that study is by Burke and colleagues. It was just recently published and it's titled Exercise Selection Differentially Influences Lower Body Regional Muscle Development. And it's pretty cool. So what they did is they had 4 different exercises. They had a seated calf raise, a straight leg calf raise on the leg press. They had a leg extension and a leg press. And they took these individuals and they just randomized each one of their legs. So it was within participant design, which is great for hypertrophy, controls a lot of things. And their leg got assigned randomly to either leg press or leg extension, and either straight leg or bent leg calf raise. And then the opposite leg did the opposite. So you have a combination of like 4 possible things for each leg. It could be leg press and straight leg, or leg press and bent leg extension, straight leg extension, bent leg, etc. And what they did was they trained them, and they looked at hypertrophy differences, and they looked at regional hypertrophy differences. They specifically looked at the rectus femoris, which is the biarticular muscle in the quadriceps, which does both hip flexion and also knee extension. The vastus lateralis, which only does knee extension, and they looked at the medial and lateral gastroc. That's the more visible top calf muscle, both closer to the center line of the body and the outside. And then also the soleus, which sits underneath, which only crosses the ankle joint, only does plantar flexion or a calf raise movement, while the gastroc is actually a weak knee flexor, but also does the same calf raise motion. Now, the reason why it's important to look at both of these movements and these 2 muscle groups is because of the prior research that's been done. Some research has shown that leg presses and squats develop the vastus lateralis quite well, but don't develop the rectus femoris, which is quite interesting, and I'll explain why we think so in a second. And that when you look at leg extensions, they develop the rectus femoris quite well, which I'll explain why that potentially is. But some data would indicate that it doesn't develop the vastus lateralis as well as squat patterns. So that's exactly what the present research found. When they were looking at the quadriceps, they found significantly greater vastus lateralis hypertrophy when assigned to the leg press. Those legs grew more in the vastus lateralis than those in the leg extension. And the opposite was true for the rectus femoris in the leg extension versus the leg press. So the question is why and what's going on here? So for one, there is probably greater range of motion about the knee that is occurring when you're doing something like a squat or a leg press than a leg extension generally. So that could explain very simply the vastus lateralis differences, right? Training at a longer muscle length, potentially better. We talked about that. I don't think we need to cover it again. The reason why the rectus femoris, however, doesn't get that same quote unquote benefit from the leg press as a leg extension is because of its biarticular nature. And if you look at various other studies on this topic, you can see when squats are performed, the rectus femoris doesn't seem to grow well. And that's because when you're doing a squat, when you're doing a leg press, when you're doing a lunge, you're doing simultaneous knee and hip extension. And because the rectus femoris crosses the knee and the hip, that means when it shortens, it is creating not only knee extension, but also hip flexion. And that hip flexion action is in direct opposition to the hip extension that your glutes are trying to do during a squat. So it basically kind of maintains a similar length and doesn't get activated very well. If you look at EMG data, it doesn't really increase surface EMG very much. And we don't need that to be super convincing. We don't have to rely on EMG data because there's a great study by Kubo and colleagues where they observed hypertrophy of the glutes and the quads, except for the rectus femoris. And as a side note, the hamstrings didn't grow either in response to squats because they are also biarticular, doing hip extension and knee flexion. So they can't really do much in the way of hip extension because that knee flexion action is also part of it, which is opposed by the quads. So what this tells us is that these biarticular muscles in compound movements where there is a joint action that opposes one of their actions, they stay relatively quiescent in terms of surface EMG activity, and then it's mirrored by the fact that they don't seem to grow. This has also actually been shown by Brandow and colleagues when they compare bench press and skull crushers, and they see that skull crushers grows the long head of the triceps more, and bench press seems to only grow the other heads, or at least not as effectively grow the long head. And the long head is a biarticular tricep muscle that crosses the shoulder and the elbow, so it does shoulder extension, which is in opposition to the shoulder flexion you're doing in pressing. So that makes sense. And then you could take those findings, if you're just looking at the comparison of leg extension and leg press, and go, well, clearly the best combination of hypertrophy, if I want to get all the love, is to do both. I want to do some type of isolated knee extension, and then I want to do some type of larger range of motion, combined multi-joint movement like a leg press or a squat. And that, therefore, high variety is good. However, when you look at the calf, what we observed was essentially in this study, much greater hypertrophy of the medial gastric membrane. And then similar-ish hypertrophy of the lateral gastroc, and not much meaningful hypertrophy of the soleus in either group, but very slightly leaning towards the seated calf raise. And if we just left it there, you could make an argument that, okay, well, sometimes maybe you should do a seated calf raise to hit that soleus a little bit. But this is not the only study on this topic. And in fact, Kinoshita and colleagues, they directly compared the seated calf raise and the standing calf raise without leg press or leg extension potentially influencing the results, which I'll explain in a second. And they found very clear differences where the soleus grew to a very similar degree in both, and the gastroc grew substantially more with standing calf raises, a straight leg calf raise compared to seated calf raises. And why would that be? Why does that make sense? Well, essentially, the soleus is a monoarticular muscle. It only crosses the ankle. So the only thing it does is extend the foot. And the traditional argument of why you might want to do both bent leg and standing calf raises is that by bending your leg, you're shortening the gastroc. You're putting it, well, this wasn't always described previously, but we know if you train a muscle at a shorter muscle length, it's less stimulative. Back in the day, they would say, hey, this is creating what's called active insufficiency. Active insufficiency or passive insufficiency is just a term that means there's less ability of actin and myosin to overlap because the muscle is too short or too long, active or passive insufficiency, relative to the optimal length where you get the most cross-bridging and it can produce the most force and therefore the most tension and grow the muscle most effectively. That's a theoretical construct that doesn't seem to be panning out in terms of being too long, but does seem to be panning out at least in being too short. And the idea, the traditional wisdom of bodybuilding is, hey, we want to inhibit the gastroc by bending the knee, and that'll force the soleus to work harder. And awesome, that is a better exercise for the soleus. But given the kind of lackluster results in this present study and Kinoshita's prior study, where they did not find a difference in soleus growth, and really it just seemed to be just as good for the soleus to do seated calf raises, but far worse for the gastroc, I think the data as a whole would indicate there's really no point doing seated calf raises, I would argue. I just don't think we need to try to isolate the soleus because it has an isolated joint function. And I think this is one of those cases where we kind of just take bodybuilding wisdom for granted. Like we believe it's good to do both seated and standing calf raises because, well, you need to inhibit the gastroc so the soleus works harder. But for some reason, we don't apply that same logic to other exercises. Like, Omar, let me ask you this. Have you ever heard anyone say that hamstring curls are a bad exercise for the hamstrings because you need to okay, I'll take a step back. I can't think of any other monoarticular muscle where we hold the same belief that we need to inhibit one of the other muscle groups to train it. So for example, the short head of the biceps femoris, that is a monoarticular muscle. It only crosses the knee. It's the one part of the hamstrings that only does knee flexion, not hip extension. All right. Now, would we ever say hamstring curls are ineffective for the short head because the rest of the hamstrings also contribute to knee flexion?
I haven't heard that.
Of course not. Like it seemed, well, maybe not, of course not. No one's ever thought of it that way. For some reason, that became a dominant narrative for calves, but we don't apply it to anything else. Like hamstring curls don't work for your semitendinosis or your the long head of your bicep femoris. Like why would you think that? Of course, that is a joint action they do. Well, you know, if you want to hit the short head though, you got to remove those guys. And like, really? Like, what is if the short head only crosses the knee? Why does it quote unquote care? And you can make an argument of like, what's the limiting factor? Is one going to fatigue more than the other? But there's no basic assumption of why there's something unique about the soleus as to it, for some reason, just needing to have that gastroc fatigue first. And the data don't bear it out. And they don't bear it out in the hamstrings either, just for the record. So nonetheless, I think this is one of those times where we have some assumptions that we have never really checked. And if we apply that broad brushstroke of variety is better, we would think, well, yeah, you want to do standing calf raises and seated calf raises. But I would argue any time you're spent doing seated calf raises would probably be better spent doing standing calf raises because you're getting no stimulus for the gastroc. And at least like 90% of the stimulus you get for seated calf raises. Like maybe the data leans a little bit to being slightly better for the soleus, but I think the overall calf growth that you get and the fact that it still is an effective soleus exercise, a standing calf raise, your time would just be better spent. It'd be more efficient just to do more standing calf raises or more straight leg calf raises. So if you look at either one in isolation, it's either, okay, is variety good or variety bad? It's like, well, you have to think about the nuances, unfortunately. And I think there's kind of like multiple levels to this. So like the entry level is pretty easy for most people to get to. Like with basic anatomical knowledge, you'll know, like if we're comparing different strength disciplines or lifting disciplines, I should say, that the biceps, the calves, the lats, and the middle deltoids are not going to be very well stimulated by like the squat, bench, and the deadlift, right? Or if we want to extend it to weightlifters, the snatch and the clean and like the overhead press. You just know that those muscle groups are not contributing to those movements, so they're probably not going to get effectively trained. And that's a great place to start. I think that's totally fine. And if you took somebody on like a quote unquote power building program, you know, they had like, let's say they're big 4. They did overhead press, or even say big 5. Like they're doing some type of regular rowing and they're doing overhead press, bench press, squat, and deadlift. They're focused on strength in those movements. Maybe it's a weighted chin or a barbell row, you know, what have you. Or if you're, you know, like a starting strength disciple, maybe you're doing a barbell row and a power clean. You'll understand that if I really want to kind of lean more towards the bodybuilding side of things and physique development, I might do some lateral raises. I'm going to do some curls. I might do one other back exercise. I'll do some calf raises and I'll call it good. But I think like then you need another level of depth to understand why certain muscles in a muscle group are not going to contribute to a movement, even though they can perform one of the joint actions that that movement entails. Like it's not obvious that the hamstrings wouldn't be active in a squat. You know, I'm doing hip extension. I read in the textbook, the hamstrings do knee flexion and hip extension. You're like, oh crap. So I have to understand the fact that because they do knee flexion, they're not going to be able to perform hip extension because there's knee extension going on at the same time. All right. And I think you need another level to also understand, okay, so I'm doing deadlifts, so hamstrings are good. Well, that one hamstring, the short head, doesn't do hip extension. You need to do some type of isolated knee flexion. And the same thing with the long head of the triceps. So unfortunately, that basic level of understanding is not going to be sufficient if someone is actually interested in maximizing their development. With that said, probably most people aren't really, if you actually drill down, they're not necessarily interested in, nor will they be bottlenecked by their overall development like that. They're not going to be picked apart in a rear double bicep when they're shredded to be like, oh, your lower hamstring is not developed enough. Most people are never going to have their body fat even low enough to see it, right? So whether it matters or not, I think is a perspective of goal. Mm-hmm. And at what point should we expect people to understand it, or when should they? I think is often a mismatch with the way content creators talk about this stuff. Because sometimes you'll see the more biomechanics focused content creators getting in very vitriolic arguments about things that are edge cases for 90% of people. And they might be thinking that they're delivering this to competitive bodybuilders, but they may not realize that half their audience are not even necessarily anywhere near maximizing their hypertrophy, nor are they ever going to notice a difference if they did. So there's context to whether exercise variety is important or not.
Eric, so many good things you just went over. Let's just touch on that briefly, because I do want to talk, I think there's more as it relates to hypertrophy and exercise variety and variation, but then also strength, the strength component. But that's very interesting what you just said, and I wholeheartedly agree in the sense that, you know, what is the average person's goal, or the audience that you're speaking to? Like, what do they actually want? And I think there's a mismatch even, which is an interesting conversation, between what someone will declare is their goal and what in their heart of hearts, what they truly want. Meaning, so to your point, we're talking, Eric, about maximizing hypertrophy. Most bros and broettes can totally get on board. Okay, like whatever. I understand that. I want to train my calves. I want to train the hamstrings, whatnot. Cool. Whatnot. I should keep all these factors in mind. And they understand that, and they might watch content related around that. But then if you're just to ask them, hey, like, what is your ideal physique as an example? Like, who do you want to look like? And in Eric's mind, natural bodybuilder, you could name people immediately and how they would look, probably how they want to end up looking. is as such that some of those minor considerations, things that should be considered if that is your goal, wouldn't actually percolate towards the top. And most of them, like that's why there's a reason why, Eric, I think for the average, so who are we talking about now and who is the target audience? Okay. But let's say for the average gym enthusiast, when they search, how to get A, B, C, D, it's usually like big biceps, like chest. The way that they envision ultimately their physique is skewed in a certain way that some of these recommendations to get, I wouldn't even say more granular, like they are valuable. They're important within the context of that conversation, but is it reaching the intended audience, or is it's not even confusing the conversation necessarily, but what is your goal and why are you training in the first place, which is, the age-old question. But I do find it interesting, just as a quick aside, like you were just talking about, so calves, obviously, my position on that, but even even squats, like we're just joking here, but like for the average natural lifter, just straight up, lower body training is not nearly as important. What you were just saying about squats, right? They think I'm hitting the squats is good enough. Well, what about the rectus femoris now? Okay, well, what about the hamstrings? Yeah, well, maybe I'll do a little bit of hamstrings, or I'm doing deadlifts. It's not as granular, their consideration, probably as what you just said, as it relates to, let's say, like the upper pec, right? Where we're talking about like the considerations for the incline bench press, the bench press, those variations are probably in the way they rank what they should or should not be doing far higher. So I think that's a very interesting conversation of how people shape content, who the content is for, and how it's being communicated.
100%. Like just the fact that there is a meme around like, bros don't let bros skip leg day means that there's a lot of people out there who are skipping leg day and they're kind of like, meh, like I understand that this probably isn't ideal for my goals. But if it was so unideal for their goals that it was readily apparent and holding them back, guess what? They wouldn't skip leg day in the first place and there wouldn't be that meme.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. The casual training of the legs just enough so that they're not embarrassingly small relative to one's upper body is kind of what most people want who are just dudes who lift. And there are parallels in women, and you see the same thing. Like I have powerlifting friends who are very high level powerlifters who I think you should maybe do a little bit more upper body accessories. And they're like, I'll just bench for singles type of thing, So I think that is often underestimated. And when content creators are like, but your hamstrings are not being trained in the squat, I think like for me, if I was to not pay attention to these things, and my goal was in a year and a half, I want to be more competitive on the WNBF pro bodybuilding stage.
Terrible idea.
There would be exactly like there are tangible downsides to that. Yeah. People would be like, you started training like the serious gym rat and your physique got worse, like that. I think that is something that a lot of people I'll put it very succinctly. That's something I need to be aware of because my own personal goals and say my clients' goals when I work with bodybuilders and powerlifters and the messaging behind a natural bodybuilding focused entity. If I don't realize and remind myself, oh, hold up, 70% of the audience of even 3D Muscle Journey, and I think this is really telling for the content creators out there, don't compete, And we specifically target competitive natural bodybuilders, and that's only 3 out of 10 of our audience members when we poll them on, say, YouTube. So I think a lot of people just don't realize that type of thing, that the fitness industry, the lifting community is pretty diverse, and most of them are getting mismatched with the content they want. And we could do a whole podcast topic on that. Maybe we should at some point. But I think that means that the level of knowledge, you don't even know what level of knowledge you need. And I think that can be part of the confusing nature of how much stuff is out there. But ultimately, that means that you kind of need to scale your level of knowledge with the type and the magnitude of the goals you have. And that's kind of why I was focusing on like bodybuilding coaches earlier. Like if you're a physique coach, if you're a bodybuilding coach, you need to kind of know all this stuff because you need to work with a diversity of clients, right? And you need to understand not only that like let's say you're a young coach and you finally get a competitive bodybuilder who wants to work with you, you need to understand everything I talked about to serve that client. At the same time, if you're a super nerd and you want to be working with a whole bunch of bodybuilding coaches, you need to understand that all the time you're spending investing into like understand the difference between a monoarticular and a biarticular muscle in different regions and how to get a more lengthened bias movement. that stuff is an opportunity cost for learning things about behavior, psychology, coaching, nutrition, etc., that are going to be potentially far more important to your, like the meat and potatoes of your coaching clientele, who do want serious muscle gain and body composition change, but they are not going to be well served by this specific advice on slight alterations in exercise selection or exercise variety, because they've only been lifting for, say, 6 months or 8 months consistently, right? So, because I remember being a young coach and I was super motivated and I wanted to be the guy who had a whole roster of bodybuilders, but I didn't. I had like, my mom as a client and a couple of people who, were soccer moms, and a guy who was like, oh, it'd be cool to one day maybe do a powerlifting meet, who never did. Yeah, and I'm like trying to get them to follow these super complex plans because it's what I want to do. That's what I'm interested in. But it wasn't necessarily what was in service to them.
Eric, love it. So 2 final points then. Is there anything that you want to discuss further as it relates to hypertrophy? Because then there is, I think, the bookend to this is the conversation as it relates to strength, which is a different conversation. So yes, let's get back to then hypertrophy.
Yeah, so I think one thing for the super nerds, especially those interested in research, if you were looking at the Burke study, and you might have heard I planted a little seed about how there's a potential effect on the calves of the leg press versus the leg extension. If you're thinking about the design here, big shout out to Burke and colleagues for doing this, because there is a little bit of plantar flexion that occurs when you do a leg press. So I thought a really cool thing that the authors did is they did a sub-analysis. So like I mentioned, randomization of assignment of exercises. So you had some legs that were doing leg extension and one type of calf raise, and some legs that were doing leg press and one of the types of calf raises. They basically removed all of the leg press legs, so there's a smaller sample size that they're looking at, to see if there were different outcomes when only looking at legs that did a leg extension in either the seated or standing calf raise, to remove the potential additional plantar flexion training that occurs when you do a leg press, because you are getting actual subcontribution there. And the findings didn't completely change, but they were a little more uncertain around the lateral gastroc and around the soleus. Like the soleus looked like it was a little bit better for seated calf raise, and the lateral gastroc essentially flipped from being better from standing calf raise to seated calf raise. And that's why I think it's really important to not only look at this study, but also Kinoshita. And when you combine the two, it's a pretty cohesive narrative that the standing calf raise is an overall, all-around better exercise. And if anything, on the margins to a very slight degree, maybe seated calf raises are better for the soleus. But it's not like standing calf raises don't effectively hypertrophy the soleus. In fact, the soleus doesn't grow much at all from calf raises relative to the gastroc. So anyway, I thought that was a really cool thing. So if anyone had kind of like a, hey, wait a minute, what about the leg press causing some calf raises? Shout out the authors, they did actually investigate that. So anyway, that's the only other thing that I think was kind of cool about this study, that they did that little sub-analysis I want to give a shout out to. But yeah, pretty cool study. And it's just the latest chapter in kind of us having this better, more nuanced understanding of exercise selection. And there's a lot more depth to this as well. I mean, obviously we've had a few guests on who could talk to that, but that was the main stuff for hypertrophy. We want to dive a bit into strength.
Eric, it's funny because we didn't announce it at the beginning. It's an hour of power. There's so much actually that could be said as it relates to training for strength, exercise variation, and variety. What would be like the top level analysis for you? Because there's a lot that could be said here. We're talking about strength training, we're talking specifically like powerlifting, we're talking weightlifting. We kind of have things that are going to be fixtures. Like if you're doing powerlifting, you will be doing the big three. And then when we talk about, variety, variation, like what are we talking about? When are we talking about someone in their training cycle? So there's many different things, but if you give like, let's say, a brief top level overview of, training for strength as it relates to exercise variety and variation.
Yeah, I think this is where the important distinction between randomization and variation is very important. And I think that there's a limited context in which just kind of switching it up generally could be good. And that is more so not related to significant variation from the movement or variety, but slight alterations to it. Because there is data on motor learning where varying the way a movement is performed, thinking about the distance of throwing a dart, for example, that actually enhances motor learning because you're having to basically re-remember the skill in a different context, which creates better recall. So it actually delays learning a new skill. Like if you were to, hey, I want you to go to this bar, stand on the line, and every day I want you to throw 10 darts at the board. You will initially get better at hitting the target. If you took somebody else and said, listen, I want you to stand 5 feet in front of the line, 5 feet behind the line, or on the line randomly, so this is randomization, you'll actually see a poorer uptake initially of the skill, but better retention if you do a retention task later. So it's about kind of the investment long-term of making the skill more, quote unquote, deeply grooved as a motor pattern, if you will. And we've talked about that before in kind of the concept of this topic previously. But so I think there could be an argument to taking a more kind of like random approach of just varying kind of a la West Side, not to, throw shade at them, not saying there wasn't any planning to it, but going, all right, I'm going to do a box squat, then I'll do a back squat, then I'll do a chain squat, then I'll do a band squat, just because variation is good. And I don't necessarily have a super strong rationale why, not that there wasn't, but I think you could do that and you might get marginal benefits because you are basically anchoring the skill by throwing different versions of it on it. I think that is different from saying I'm a power lifter and I'm going to do, competition squat, then I'll do hack squat or leg press or lunges. Like I think once you start getting into this, it's potentially like a different movement pattern altogether, or different enough that it might be viewed that way. I think that doesn't make a lot of sense. I think when you are using accessories, when you are using distant variations of a movement, or when you are using, say, a different exercise altogether that's training the same muscle group, I think that's where you want variation, but not randomization. You want it to be purposeful because of the importance of specificity. And we can't step away from just the clear anecdotal power of seeing how important specificity can be. No matter what type of research design we have, the reality is that there are people who literally only do the squat, bench, and deadlift, and literally primarily just heavy, who are champion level powerlifters. Yeah. And what I said before about anecdotes is they don't tell us what's optimal. They can't. That's just the nature of anecdotes. But they can tell you that at least for the people observing those anecdotes, that is not something that is a barrier to their success. And I think there's enough examples of this, like a lot of members of the French team right now, or the story of the Bulgarian weightlifting system, or a few other emblematic examples of this in strength sport, where a highly specific approach can be effective. Now, there's costs. There's obviously survivorship bias, but we know that for some people, it can be sufficient to get a gold medal in weightlifting or become a world champion powerlifter. And I think we can't deny that. And I think that speaks to how this could be making it far more complex than it needs to be. When you're talking about, I need this variation here and this type of wave loading approach, and every 3 weeks we're going to do a close variation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what I would encourage people to do is think of variations on the main lifts in powerlifting and in weightlifting as specific tools to solve specific problems. So you can start with a relatively specific approach, and then as you encounter issues or a slower rate of progress, you try to identify the root cause of it and then use variations as a tool. So I've talked about this before. I'm not going to, wax and wane eloquently about it, but weightlifting is a great example. If you see a error or a motor error in a certain portion of the lift, someone's over pulling or under pulling, you can change the variation so that they can't do that and still successfully complete it, So that would be something like the snatch balance or the snatch from hang. So they have to fully extend to actually get underneath it, and then you bring it back into the full movement. Or something like in a sumo puller, someone who tends to over pull light weights and then lose balance, you can actually have them pull a lot of light weights so that they get challenged by that balance challenge. Or someone who has the bar drift away from them in a conventional deadlift at the initiation, you can have them pause mid-shin at the point where it normally drifts away, just so they can get more time and exposure of feeling that contact. Or someone just gets banged up by the competition lifts. They get pain and they have a limited amount of volume or at a limited load that they can do within a week, and you think they'd benefit from more volume, but that specific movement is capped, say biomechanically or orthopedically, to how much they can do. At least it seems that way. All right, what's the closest variation that doesn't have pain? Because that's the next best option. Or, hey, we're really, really far from competition. And I think that you're at a stage in your career where you'd benefit from having bigger muscles. And go back to our recent podcast episode with Trex, where we talked about hypertrophy training for powerlifters. Maybe the best time spent that I could have, even if in the short term, for the next 4 weeks, frequent singles would make me the strongest. What might make me actually stronger in 20 weeks could be doing a sufficient amount, a minimum effective dose, shout out Dr. Pack, of the big three, to maintain or build the skill a little bit, while I actually spend a lot of time investing in easier to recover from, less orthopedically taxing movements to build the muscles that are involved in those. So I think that kind of nuance is needed for exercise variety for powerlifting. And it's a very different thing for bodybuilding, where essentially you need to think about, how do I train all the muscles I care about, understanding the complexities of functional anatomy and how they interact with exercise selection.
Eric, that's probably as succinct as one could be when talking about strength training, and then as it pertains to variety and variation. One thing I want to give a shout out that you mentioned earlier on when you were discussing hypertrophy, exercise variation, and variety is the functional limit that we all have as it relates to the amount of time we can give towards training. Even as you're talking about, like, I was just thinking, like, the soleus and, the benefit or the lack thereof of the seated calf raise, where it's like, you can only do so many exercises. You only have so much time. You're trying to maximize hypertrophy. And even if, as you said, like, let's just, in the theoretical scenario that there could be some very minor benefit of one particular muscle group, it's like, well, how many movements are you doing in this day? And I think that's where some of the subtle alchemy, and I think it's really cool you post your training, on your IG and like so on and so forth. But it's like, okay, you're someone that actually has a pretty hard limit in terms of the amount of hours you could dedicate because you're a busy individual towards training. It's like, well, then how many exercises, once again, do you do? How many variations do you do per muscle group? And I think that's just like a kind of a cool look at a practical example, but that is a consideration that every single person that tries to maximize, or let's say train for hypertrophy, they run into, and that's something that should be discussed.
Absolutely. And I'll just give a case study to prove that point, because ultimately that's exactly what you run into, is how close to the ideal for my goals can I get with the constraints I have? And that's effective programming in the real world. So shout out to my prior client and someone who I've done some coach of the coaching of, Reed Frisbee. He's a natural bodybuilder here in New Zealand, down in Invercargill. Big shout out to him. Champion, amazing physique, very aesthetic. He recently sent me a text because he's no longer in the competitive phase. And he was like, hey man, if you could only do 2 lower body exercises to maintain your muscle size or to develop everything, what would they be? And I had to really think about it, because that's a level of constraints. It's a theoretical question, but that type of mental model and thinking can make you really think through some things. And I thought, you know what? A rear foot elevated Bulgarian split squat, because the back leg, you're having to do some isolated knee extension to stabilize, and you're stretching the rectus femoris, and you're getting glutes and quads in the front leg, and then a leg curl. Because then I'm getting rec fem, I'm getting hamstring from the leg curl, I'm getting glutes. If I get heavy enough, I'm actually getting a little bit of erectors. Like if I had to just choose 2 for bodybuilding. That was where I got to, right? But that's a very different answer to, hey, I'm a novice and I have 3 hours per week to train. What would I do? I might not do leg curls or Bulgarian split squats at all, especially if they have no competitive aspirations. It would be like, well, let's find a hinge in a squat pattern you like, and maybe do some calf raises if you want more or less overall, lower body development. And that's a very different answer to what I'd say to a competitive bodybuilder who said, I'm willing to give you 8 hours per week of training. And then I'm like, all right, let's make a big Excel spreadsheet, right? So that's the type of nuance that I think is entirely missed when people talk across each other on social media, but is truly what a coach needs to do when they're fitting the combination of their knowledge with the constraints of the person and the appropriateness of their level of development and where they're trying to go.
Folks, should have said at the beginning, this is a monster episode. I think per unit of time, this one is full of many golden nuggets. It's been another hour of power. We appreciate every single one of you for listening to another episode. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review on Apple iTunes. It does seem to help us out. 5 stars is not enough. Okay, we have new standards. Inflation is real. Review inflation is real. 5 stars is the bare minimum to be read on air, but it's the quality of what you're writing that will ultimately dictate how we interpret what you're saying. And so you could leave a rating or review, but just understand that some hosts, well, the way they receive even perfect reviews, it's a little tough. It's a little tough out here. But we're back every single Monday from now until the end of time. We'll catch you in that next episode.